Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am Michael Matt with a quick word now, not from Remnant TV this morning, but actually from the Remnant newspaper, more specifically from the Remnant Press. Now, let me just set this up by saying oftentimes we talk down here about how much we appreciate our Protestant viewers. Believe it or not, we've got a lot of Protestant viewers. And many of you weigh in on a given topic. Last week we talked about Marian apparitions, and a bunch of you came in and said, you worship the Mother of God. You guys worship statues, the Pope is not biblical, purgatory is not biblical, and all of this. And so what I wanted to do today is just suggest a little way that because I just don't have time to answer all of those concerns. Those are big, weighty theological and historical points that need to be addressed. And I want to just suggest to you a possible option on how we can kind of cover all this without disrespecting each other, but also providing answers and a good discussion. And I want to lead then with this book. I mentioned it before, but now this book is in its third printing. This is my great-grandfather's book, Letters to a Protestant Friend. Again, it's in its third printing. We first published this book 2 years ago when it was new, but it was only new to English-speaking readers living 130 years after this book had been published in the original German. So I think this is a really good tool and a very useful tool for us to get an actual constructive discussion, apologetic discussion going on, ecumenism and so forth, the true meaning of that word. My great-grandfather is a convert from Lutheranism. His name is Hugo Klapproth, and his arguments to his Lutheran friend here are really fascinating, but not just to Catholics who might be interested in a conversion story. I think more specifically to Lutherans, to Protestants, who have a lot to disagree with Catholics over. Again, Mary worship, faith alone, sola scriptura, the theology of the papacy, the non-biblical, quote-unquote, roots of purgatory and the sacrament of confession. It's a big one. Why do I need a priest? I can just confess my sins to God, right? All the go-to Protestant arguments are refuted in this book with expert biblical exegesis, a smart guy, historical background, considerable historical acumen, and most importantly now, in a day of, tearing each other apart, in the ruthless world of social media and so forth, it's presented in the patient and charitable, from the patient and really charitable approach of one former Protestant to his current Protestant friend. So you can see why this is pretty unique as far as an apologetics tool. It's very charitably written because this is a guy who was a Protestant all his life. And he's saying, wait a minute, I looked into all this and here's what I found, okay? So to set this up, who was Hugo Klapproth? I think to be kind of helpful. For me, he was someone we got here. He was this faded photo on the living room wall of my childhood home. My great-grandfather, Hugo Klapproth. He died a century ago, a long time ago. He died a century ago. He was born in Germany in 1848, immigrated to America in 1890. He actually died in Switzerland on September 3rd, 1919. So we're going way back. And I was happy to discover, my father had been talking about this man's letters when I was a child, but I never read them because they were in German. So I was really happy to discover these letters only in 2022, just a couple of years ago, when my eldest daughter, Cecilia, who's a history major, she dug up a copy of her great-great-grandfather's book, this book, in the original German. She had it translated into English, and then she got busy getting to know her great-great-grandfather, Hugo, and so did I, by extension, as we went and undertook this project. So this little book was completed now on New Year's Eve in 1894. So as you read it, it's not just an apologetics thing. It's great historical little tidbits and fun little points as this man writes personal letters. It was finished, for example, finished writing it just before midnight, as Grandpa Klapproth explains in I think it's the last chapter of this book. He writes, "It has grown late as I have worked on this letter. Outside, the midnight bells are ringing in the new year, 1895 AD. Will this year bring you, my friend, peace and true happiness," he writes. "Will it lead you home to the mother abandoned by your and my forefathers?" Talking about the Catholic Church there. So you can kind of picture him, and it comes across beautifully in this little book, sitting in his study, a century or so ago, joking with his friend about his wife and how, she hadn't put enough oil in the lamp for him to complete the project that night because she wanted him to get to sleep. And so night after night, this beautiful old gentleman writes these letters trying to coax an old and dear Protestant friend into the embrace of Holy Mother Church, which he had recently discovered and into which he had recently been baptized. He wrote the letters in his spare time in the evenings after he'd come home from work. It's all very kind of homey, a beautiful story. And for context now, Hugo's grandson would be my father. We got something here. My father, Walter Matt, who founded the traditional Catholic newspaper, The Remnant. This was founded in 1967. That's his grandson. And the Remnant now is the oldest Catholic biweekly newspaper in America. This is what I'm always trying to promote on our show. Subscribe to this newspaper, get into the archive, find out how we got where we are. My father was also for a time the editor of The Wanderer right after he got out of World War II. And The Wanderer, oldest Catholic newspaper, weekly newspaper in the country, was founded 100 years before in 1867. So the history of the Remnant, this gets a little complicated, but the history of the Remnant newspaper now, this traditional Catholic paper of record, begins actually in 1867 when Hugo Klapproth, right here, took over The Wanderer. Here's an old copy of The Wanderer. 2 years after a couple of Benedictine monks at the Assumption Church down in St. Paul, church is still functioning, they had founded the Wanderer, Der Wanderer, to help inform and safeguard German immigrants against the ideas of German Freemasonry, the German Enlightenment, ideas which would eventually give rise to Hitler's National Socialism. So it's quite a story. So after 2 years now, struggling to make Der Wanderer a success, these two monks at the Church of the Assumption in St. Paul realized they had no idea what they were doing. It just wasn't happening. It wasn't getting off the ground. It was beyond their abilities. So they decided to bring in a professional lay editor to take over Der Wanderer. So that was my great-grandfather, Hugo Klapproth. That's this guy, born in Zellerfield, Germany in 1848. Hugo emigrated to Kentucky. Then he moved over to Wisconsin, where he worked as the editor of the Lutheran daily newspaper, the Milwaukee Germania, it was called. This is where it gets interesting to those of you who are Protestants, because it was at this point that Hugo became aware he was still a respected member of the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church, in other words. And during this time, a scholarly historian in Germany by the name of Father Johannes Jansen, Jesuit, S.J., had just completed a 4-volume study of the history of the Reformation in Germany, in which he said some things that were not overly flattering to one Martin Luther. And because of that, the Lutheran establishment over in Germany and here in the States was really anxious to see the work of this Father Johannes Jansen, to see it refuted, right? 4 volumes is a big deal against Lutheranism, the arguments of Luther. So the editors of the Germania determined that Hugo Klapproth, their guy Hugo, was the best qualified to refute Father Jansen's case against Martin Luther. But guess what happened? During the course of his study of this anti-Lutheran set of books, great-grandfather Hugo becomes very conflicted. And as he continued his research, he becomes persuaded now by Father Jansen's arguments in favor of Catholicism. So he had to inform his editors that they would have to find another guy for this project because he was becoming a Catholic. And eventually he and his family converted to Roman Catholicism, to the faith. And news of Hugo Klapproth's conversion reached our 2 monks up here in St. Paul, who were running Der Wanderer at the time, and they invited him to come up and take over the struggling Der Wanderer newspaper. He agreed, and after several years of editing Der Wanderer, he decided he needed a younger assistant, and that assistant's name was Joseph Matt. Joseph Matt is here in this photo. This is my grandfather, another German immigrant, by the way, who was born on October 16, 1877 in Kirweiler, Germany. Now, after arriving in New York in 1895 at just 17 years of age, Joseph Matt, this fella, had earned his scholarship to Canisius College, and after his graduation, took a job as a reporter for several German Catholic daily newspapers, first in Buffalo, New York, and then in Pittsburgh. Now, his unapologetically Catholic approach to the problems of his day attracted the attention of Hugo Klapproth, running Der Wanderer up in St. Paul, who invited Joseph to come up and join him at Der Wanderer. So in 1897, my grandfather teamed up with my great-grandfather here in St. Paul and thus began his life in long service to the Catholic Press Apostolate. Before he was done, he was voted Catholic Emeritus Editor of America. In fact, he was in harness for 50 years at the Wanderer, all through the Warriors and everything else. All of this stuff is in much of it is in the Wanderer archive, but also in the Remnant archive, which is now fully online for those of you who want to pursue it a little bit more. This history is very interesting. So in 1899, failing health compelled Klapproth here, Hugo Klapproth, to return to Germany, leaving his future son-in-law Joseph Matt behind to take his place as editor of Der Wanderer, which eventually became The Wanderer. Joseph returned briefly, however, to Germany that same year in order to wed Hugo Klapproth's daughter, Marie, who's my grandmother. So there's the family tree. Lots of interesting information in there. And now this union produced 6 children, the youngest of whom was Walter Matt, my father, the future editor of The Wanderer and founder of now the Remnant newspaper. There it is. So that's the historical context for these gentlemen and their great work in service of the church. But the thing is, Hugo Klapproth's letters are suddenly, I think, as they appear in this book now, I'm not trying to hawk this product, this book, so much as I think it's such a valuable contribution to the discussion we're all having, not only on our show, the Remnant Underground, but also just in general now, with the way things are going, the anti-religion sentiment, what's happening with Francis. These letters have suddenly become more relevant today, in my opinion, than they probably were in 1895. Why? Because they show how the Catholic Church was perceived by the non-Catholic world in the past. How she had actually already been the church of accompaniment. She was accompanying whole entire waves of European immigrants, Irish, German, whatever, throughout that whole period. She's welcoming them, educating them, and then made them her own sons and daughters, as was the case with my great-grandfather convert, Hugo Klapproth. So today, when the Catholic churchmen, now like Pope Francis, are embarrassed, they're making stuff up, they're making fake news about what the Catholic Church before the council was all about. They're literally embarrassed of the pre-Vatican II attitudes about the faith. Well, my grandfather's autobiographical account of how things actually were really helps to put the lie to this modernist, revisionist history that we're seeing all around us. A short book, but it really puts the lie to that. In point of fact, long before Vatican II, the Catholic Church was teeming with vocations to the priesthood. It was united worldwide by the Latin Mass, united, as in it was a unifying thing that unified Catholics from this country, from Germany, from Spain, from France, all over the world, right? It was in charge, the Catholic Church at that time, in charge of the largest hospital system in the world, the largest school system, including higher education. They invented the higher education system, the college system, the Catholic Church did, right, in the world. And it's marked by vast expansion all across the globe, and blessed by an endless caravan of converts, such as this man, such as my own great-grandfather, converts to the Catholic Church because it was so attractive and it was doing such a great job before Vatican II, you see? So these letters emerge as like the letters of a first-hand witness to the truth, debunking all these lies coming out of the Vatican today about how the church didn't accompany anybody and it was cold and it was heartless to those who were on the peripheries, right? Hogwash. Absolute nonsense. And these historical accounts prove that it's hogwash. The Catholic Church, into which my great-grandfather converted and so many tens and hundreds of thousands of others converted at that time, was attracting the most influential thinkers in the country, in the world, both sides of the Atlantic. The most influential activists, the writers, the greatest writers of the day, men of letters who found it impossible to ignore the church's clarion call, the call of Mother Church, converts such as G.K. Chesterton, John Henry Newman, Maurice Baring, Charles Peguy, Robert Hugh Benson, Ronald Knox, Christopher Dawson, Evelyn Waugh, on and on and on it goes. All drawn by the spiritual and intellectual firepower of the mighty pre-conciliar Catholic Church, whose mission, by the way, to the poor and to the impoverished and to the immigrants of the world was known to all. You see, the ultimate church of accompaniment before Vatican II. So this little book of letters, I'm so proud of this for so many reasons, but it provides an inadvertent and powerful indictment of those voices today, and we know who we're talking about, who would denigrate the Catholic Church of yesterday as an ivory tower inhabited by rigid neo-Pelagians who failed to welcome the immigrants of the world with mercy and love. Lies, friends. It's all lies. Nothing could be further from the truth. And my great-grandfather would reject, as so many of that time period, especially the men I just named. I was just talking yesterday about the fact that J.R.R. Tolkien was absolutely a traditional Catholic. We're going to do a show on this. Wonderful stories about him encountering the Novus Ordo Mass early on and just dashing out of the church in disgust by what was happening. You know, again, another one of these great Catholics from the past. They would, like my great-grandfather, would totally reject these bigoted, revisionist ideas, anti-Catholic ideas coming out of the Vatican today. Why? Why would my great-grandfather reject it? Because he himself was one of those people of the world whom Holy Mother Church had adopted as one of her own. You see? So how much did this particular convert, Hugo Klapproth, how much did he love the Catholic Church? Well, if you read these letters, you'll see that his love for the Catholic Church is positively palpable in every line. And once he'd converted from a very passionate Lutheran, once he'd converted to the Catholic faith, he spends his spare time, night after night, trying to bring his friends into the light, into the truth of what Catholicism really was. This is a love story, you know, trying to bring his friends and family with him into the Catholic Church. Why? Well, you read the book to find out why. He explains why. Also, in this book, we discover arguments, old and new, that remind us of how and why the Catholic Church, no matter how sinful her members are today, right? How much chaos, how much scandal. The Church is nevertheless the spotless bride of Jesus Christ, and this is the contribution that it brings, I think, to Catholics who are discouraged and sad and disheartened by what's happening. Spotless bride of Jesus Christ has not changed. As such, Catholic men and women of history would today absolutely join the ranks of the traditional Catholics in the defense of the church that they love, right? Writing 130 years ago, Hugo Klapproth is a traditional Catholic pioneer. He wouldn't have called himself that, but that's what he is. And when you read this, you see it loud and clear. You read it and you can see it very clearly. The traditions he defends in his day, 130 years ago, are the very same traditions that we defend today. The Mass that he defends and he attended for the rest of his life, he talks about in this book, the very same Latin Mass we defend and attend today as traditionalists. The Catholic teachings that he champions in 1895, the very same Catholic teachings, dogmas, morals, right? Doctrines and dogmas that we champion here in 2024. Nothing, in other words, has changed. God is still in his heaven, and his church is still the one true Church of Jesus Christ, always and forever, regardless of what Pope Francis or anybody else says to the contrary. So from his grave, Hugo Klapproth reminds us all that we can never leave the church, that we are called by God to stay and to fight and to survive and to hand down the faith of our fathers to our sons, exactly as our fathers, grandfathers, great-grandfathers handed it down to us. Our task remains the same. So again, if you're feeling a little down and discouraged right now what's happening to the Catholic Church, do yourself a favor, order this book. It'll help you understand why the church is under attack, why the attack will ultimately fail, and why we need to stay, stand, and fight for the church of our fathers. I'm Michael Matt for Remnant Press, this time, not Remnant TV. Thank you for listening. We'll put a link right down here. You can click and order this book today. I think you're really going to enjoy it. God bless you, and we'll see you next time.